Have you ever believed in something so firmly that you never questioned it, only to watch it shatter in one unexpected moment? We all carry silent assumptions, ideas we inherited from people around us, from news headlines, from passing comments we never bothered to examine. And sometimes, it takes just one quiet truth to make us realize how wrong the world can be. It reminds us how easily a lie becomes common knowledge when enough people repeat it. For years, there has been a strange, unspoken insult floating through conversations about the Philippines. You've probably heard it at least once. Filipinos don't have world-class education, or the gentler version that still stings if you're Filipino. Well, it's good enough for Southeast Asia, but not quite global level. People whispered it with the comfort of those who believe they already know the truth. Some said it casually, others with a smug certainty, as though the entire world had agreed it was fact. And then came the moment that surprised even those who thought they were open-minded. A senior professor from Harvard, one of the most respected medical educators on the planet, repeated the same line in a panel discussion, that the Philippines was not the ideal destination for serious medical training or research. He said it with that slow, deliberate authority reserved for experts who rarely get challenged. The room nodded along. Even those who disagreed stayed silent, as if it wasn't worth arguing. But what if I told you that just a few months later, that same professor stood in another conference, paused for a long breath, and admitted he had been wrong? His confession didn't make headlines. It didn't spread to the same people who repeated the insult for years. But it was real, and it was sparked by something he never expected: the arrival of thousands of Iranian students who traveled quietly, almost anonymously, to the Philippines in 2025. They were not tourists, not gamblers, not adventurers. They were young men and women fleeing something they couldn't bear any longer. And they came searching for something the world told them they wouldn't find here. Among them was a young man named Arshan, a 23-year-old engineering student from Shiraz. He wasn't famous. He didn't come from wealth. He wasn't part of any political group. He was, in many ways, painfully ordinary, except for one truth. His life had been shaped by a series of losses he never agreed to. A father who never returned from a protest. A mother who carried sickness for years because medicine became too expensive. A future that seemed to shrink every time he looked at the news. Yet what broke him wasn't the war. It wasn't the politics. It wasn't even poverty. It was the moment he realized his education, the thing he believed could save him, was slowly failing him too. Professors who couldn't stay, equipment that hadn't been updated in decades, doors closing no matter how hard he tried to push them open. He had already tried everything the world told him to try. He applied to universities in the US. He was rejected. He tried Europe. He was told to wait another year. He even considered Japan. But the cost crushed him before he even started the process. His hope kept shrinking until it felt like a thin thread he could barely hold on to. And then, one night, while scrolling through forums where desperate students shared desperate ideas, he saw a small comment, almost a whisper, from someone who had left Iran 2 years earlier. "Try the Philippines," the comment said. "It's not what the world says it is. It saved me." Arshan stared at it for a long time. He didn't know a single Filipino. He didn't speak a word of Filipino. All he had was a name of a university in Manila, a photo of a campus that looked warmer than anything he had seen in months, and a message from someone who claimed this strange, distant country had given him a second life. He didn't believe it. Not yet. But something inside him stirred. Something halfway between fear and hope. And that tiny movement in his heart, is where his journey truly began. When Arshan finally allowed himself to imagine leaving, it wasn't excitement that filled him. It was fear. A quiet fear, the kind that doesn't scream but sinks deep into the chest. Fear of failing again. Fear of hoping too much. Fear of discovering that the world really had no place left for someone like him. But when you grow up with doors constantly shutting in your face, even the smallest crack of light becomes impossible to ignore. He started reading everything he could find about the Philippines. Not the glossy brochures or the tourist videos, but the late-night forum posts from ordinary people. An Iranian girl who studied nursing in Cebu wrote about how Filipino students prayed before exams, holding hands like a family. A young man described how a professor in Davao had lent him money for medicine without ever asking for it back. Another spoke about a community in Manila that offered free meals to foreign students who were struggling. These weren't things Arshan was used to hearing about any country. They felt unreal, too soft, too gentle for a world he had learned to see as sharp and unforgiving. Yet a strange warmth grew inside him, something he tried to brush away but couldn't. He told himself he was being naive. After all, wasn't this the same country everyone mocked for not being world-class? The same place that Professor had dismissed? But the more he read, the more the world's insults seemed shallow, almost hollow compared to the voices of those who had lived there. Still, his life in Iran continued shrinking. His mother's illness worsened. Medicines became harder to find. The university he attended cut half of its laboratory hours because electricity was too unreliable. That was the moment he felt something break in him. Not violently, but with a kind of exhausted surrender, the realization that staying meant slowly fading. And so he made the decision that terrified him the most. He borrowed money. He sold what little he had. He booked a one-way ticket to Manila. But leaving home did not magically erase his struggles. The airport itself felt like a test of endurance. Officials questioned him. Fellow passengers stared at him. He felt the weight of every stereotype, every limitation placed on him by his nationality. At one point he wondered if he should turn around, but then he remembered his mother's face the night before he left. She had cupped his cheeks, whispered a prayer in trembling Persian, and told him, "Find the place where God still listens." The flight felt endless, hours blurred into moments of anxiety, flashes of hope, and an overwhelming uncertainty about what waited on the other side. And when the plane finally landed, he didn't feel triumph. He felt small, lost, unsure if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Ninoy Aquino International Airport was loud, crowded, and warm in a way that pressed against his skin. He clutched his bag, overwhelmed by the unfamiliarity. He expected indifference. He expected coldness. Instead, a security guard smiled and said, "Welcome, sir," with a sincerity that startled him. A janitor sweeping the floor nodded at him as though he were an old friend. Even the immigration officer greeted him with a gentle, "Good morning," before stamping his passport. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't grand. But small kindnesses have a way of slipping past defenses you didn't know you had. For Arshan, it was the first moment in years where he felt like the world wasn't pushing him away. Yet uncertainty still lingered. He didn't know the city. He didn't know the culture. He didn't know if the university would truly accept him despite the letter he carried. And deep down, he didn't know if this country, this unfamiliar nation thousands of kilometers from home, could really be the answer to everything he had lost. But then, somewhere between the chaos of the arrivals area and the Manila heat wrapping around him like a blanket, he noticed something unexpected. A small group of people standing near the exit, holding signs written in Iranian Persian. They were young, some barely older than him. When they saw him looking, one of them raised a hand and smiled. "Are you new?" the young man asked in accented English. Arshan nodded, unsure. "Welcome to the Philippines," the stranger said. "You're safe now." And for the first time in a very long time, Arshan felt something inside him loosen, not because he had found answers, but because he sensed he was finally in a place where answers might exist. The drive from the airport to Manila felt like drifting through two worlds at once. Outside the window, the city moved with an energy that confused him at first. Lively, chaotic, imperfect, but strangely full of warmth. Vendors waved at children as if they were family. Jeepney drivers laughed with strangers. Even the traffic, as overwhelming as it was, carried a kind of rhythm that felt more human than mechanical. It was unlike anything he had seen in Iran or the countries he once dreamed of studying in. His first stop was a small dormitory near the university. It wasn't fancy. The walls were old, the furniture simple, but the landlady welcomed him with a sincerity that caught him off guard. She opened the door wide, as if greeting a nephew returning from a long trip, and said, "Come in, Anak." He didn't know what Anak meant. Later, he learned it meant "my child," and when he did, the memory of that moment felt like a gentle hand on his shoulder. But it wasn't a single gesture that shifted him. It was the accumulation of small, unexpected kindnesses that began to carve away at the heaviness he carried. On his first day at the university, he wandered the hallways, nervous and uncertain. A Filipino student noticed him looking lost, approached him without hesitation, and said, "Hi, are you new? Want me to show you around?" It wasn't the words that surprised him. It was the tone, casual, warm, as if offering help to a stranger was the most normal thing in the world. He thought back to the universities he had applied to abroad, where emails went unanswered and rejections felt cold and mechanical. Here, a simple gesture from someone he didn't even know felt like the first sign that maybe, just maybe, he had made the right choice. Yet it was the classroom experience that truly shifted something inside him. His first lecture was in a medium-sized room, filled with Filipino and foreign students alike. He expected a dry, distant lesson. Instead, the professor, a middle-aged woman with glasses slipping down her nose, walked in and began the session with a prayer. Not a forced one, not a ritual done out of habit. It was soft, heartfelt, spoken with gratitude rather than obligation. Students bowed their heads not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Arshan didn't understand every word, but he understood the feeling. Faith had always been complicated for him, something tied to politics, control, and fear. But here, faith sounded like hope, like humility, like belonging. And then the lecture began. He had expected outdated materials, slow pacing, a sense of limitation. Instead, the professor taught with passion, weaving real-world engineering problems with stories of Filipino resilience during disasters. She spoke of rebuilding communities, of designing solutions not for profit, but for people. She talked about engineering not as a career, but as a responsibility. There was a fire in her voice, a seriousness softened by compassion that made him sit straighter in his chair. How could the world have been so wrong? How could people dismiss this country so easily when what he was seeing didn't match any of their words? That question echoed even louder the evening he visited the campus clinic. He had been feeling ill from the change in weather and expected to wait for hours or be told to come back another day. Instead, a nurse with a warm smile placed a hand gently on his arm and said, "Don't worry, we'll take care of you." She spoke as if caring was not her job, but her calling. When he apologized for taking her time, she shook her head and answered softly, "You're far from home. That means you need extra kindness." He didn't know why, but those words stayed with him long after he left. They felt like a thread stitching something back together inside him, something he thought had been torn permanently. And then there was the community. The small Catholic chapel near his dorm, where people lit candles not out of desperation but love. The neighbors who smiled at him every morning. Children who waved even if they didn't know him. A man who offered him food during a power outage, insisting he take the bigger portion. These were not grand gestures. They were ordinary moments, simple moments. But in their simplicity, they carried a power he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, Arshan caught himself breathing a little easier, stepping a little lighter, allowing the possibility that life did not always have to be a fight. He wasn't ready to say it out loud. Not yet. But the Philippines was no longer just a place he had gone to escape. It was becoming a place where he was beginning to heal. There comes a moment in every journey when the world stops feeling foreign. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with fireworks or a dramatic revelation. It slips in quietly, like the sun easing its way through a half-open curtain. For Arshan, that moment came one late afternoon as he sat on a worn wooden bench behind the university chapel, listening to a group of Filipino students singing hymns. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the emotion, the way their voices rose together, tender but steady, as if they weren't just singing to God but singing to hope itself. The harmonies wrapped around him, whispering a truth he had forgotten, that even in suffering, people could choose joy, not out of naivety, but out of strength. He watched their faces, glowing in the soft light of the setting sun. None of them looked wealthy. None looked privileged. Yet each carried an ease, a quiet confidence born from a faith that life, no matter how hard, was still beautiful. And in that moment, something inside him cracked open. A warmth spread through his chest, fragile at first, then undeniable. It was the beginning of his transformation. Days passed, and the Philippines began revealing its soul to him in ways he could not have predicted. In the cafeteria, he found himself laughing with classmates over simple meals. Not forced laughter, real laughter, the kind that shook off dust from parts of the heart untouched for years. On jeepneys, he witnessed strangers offering their seats to elders without a second thought. At the dorm, he saw students sharing food, Wi-Fi passwords, stories, even burdens, with a generosity that felt almost sacred. Then there was Mang Lito, the campus janitor, who always greeted him as boss, even though Arshan insisted he wasn't. One evening, after seeing him sit alone looking exhausted, Mang Lito placed a cold bottle of water beside him and said, "You look like someone who carries too much. Drink, boss. The world is lighter when we don't carry it alone." It was such a simple gesture. But simple things often hold the deepest truth. Piece by piece, these moments built a new world around him, a world where kindness wasn't rare, where compassion wasn't conditional, where community wasn't something you earned, but something freely given. And slowly, the tension he brought with him from Iran began to dissolve, replaced by something he had not allowed himself to feel in years: belonging. It hit him hardest the day he fell sick again. The weather had shifted, and with it came the fatigue and dizziness he had long learned to hide. He tried to push through his classes, but by noon, he could barely stand. When he finally reached the dorm lobby, he collapsed into a chair, trembling and soaked in sweat. He expected the usual: indifference, annoyance, maybe a few curious stares. Instead, within seconds, a group of Filipino students rushed toward him. Someone brought water. Another called a nurse. Someone placed a hand on his back, whispering, "It's okay. We're here." The words soft enough to keep him grounded. And then the landlady, that warm woman who had called him anak on the first day, arrived, flustered and teary-eyed, holding a rosary, She placed her hand on his forehead, then clasped his hand in hers and prayed. Prayed as though he were her own son lying there. Prayed with a faith so deep it pushed back every dark memory he had carried, every moment of fear, every doubt that had ever convinced him he was alone in the world. In that moment, he felt something break, not the painful kind of breaking he had known before, but the kind that frees you, the kind that strips away the walls around your heart so the truth can finally enter. He had experienced kindness before, but never like this, never so unconditional, never so instinctive, never so human. Tears slipped down his face before he could stop them, not from pain, not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that he had found something no country, no institution, no system had ever given him. Care. Real care. When he finally regained enough strength to speak, he whispered the words almost to himself. I have never seen this anywhere else. The room fell quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the electric fan and the landlady squeezing his hand a little tighter. And in that silence, in that fragile moment between breath and heartbeat, he understood the truth fully. The Philippines was no longer just a place where he lived. It had become the place that saved him. Recovery did not come in a single day. It arrived slowly, like dawn creeping over a horizon that had long been dark. But as Arshan regained his strength, he began to realize that something deeper than his body had healed. Something internal. Something that had been silently breaking for years. The belief that he mattered, that he had a future, that the world still had a place for him. Life in Manila settled into a rhythm that felt natural, almost comforting. Mornings began with the sound of tricycles humming along the street, with children laughing on their way to school, with neighbors greeting each other as if each day was a blessing not to be taken for granted. Afternoons were filled with classes that challenged him, inspired him, sometimes even overwhelmed him, but never made him feel small. Evenings brought gatherings near the dormitory, students sharing food, telling stories, sometimes singing songs that drifted through hallways like gentle echoes of home. And somewhere in that rhythm, Arshan found himself changing in ways he hadn't been prepared for. He studied harder, not out of fear, but out of gratitude. He smiled more, laughed more, listened more. His shoulders, once heavy from the burdens of home, now relaxed in a way that made him almost unrecognizable to himself. He felt his heart soften each time he saw Filipino families praying before meals, each time he witnessed strangers help each other without waiting for anything in return, each time he passed by the small chapel and heard its doors open to anyone seeking a moment of peace. What surprised him most was how this country treated his brokenness, not as something to hide, but as something to hold gently. He remembered one evening in particular, sitting outside the dormitory with a Filipino classmate named Jerome. The sun was dipping into the horizon, painting the sky gold and orange. They talked about life, about dreams, about the pain they carried but rarely talked about. At one point, without hesitation, Jerome said, "You know, here in the Philippines, we don't just survive. We find joy even in the struggle. That's how we keep going." Arshan didn't answer immediately. He just let the words sink in. Because they weren't advice. They weren't meant to impress. They were simply a reflection of a people who had learned to turn wounds into wisdom, sorrow into strength, and setbacks into beginnings. That was when it hit him, the realization that the Philippines had not only given him a second chance, it had given him a new way of seeing the world. His professors noticed the change. His dorm mates noticed it too. Even the landlady, wiping down the front desk one morning, smiled at him and said, "You're different now, anak. Braver." And she was right. He was braver, not because life had suddenly become easy, but because he no longer felt like he was facing it alone. Months passed, and with each passing day, he knew the truth more clearly. He didn't want to leave. What had begun as an escape had become a home. What he thought would be temporary had become deeply rooted. What he believed was the end of his path had become the beginning. Years from now, he might not remember every lecture, every jeepney ride, every evening meal. But he would remember the hands that helped him when he fell, the smiles that welcomed him when he arrived, the prayers whispered for him when he was too weak to whisper his own. And the feeling, the profound, overwhelming feeling, that this country had restored something inside him he thought was gone forever. When he looked back on his life before the Philippines, he realized he had been merely surviving. But here, in this archipelago of faith and resilience, he had learned how to live again. And his story was not unique. Behind him came thousands more, Iranian students seeking hope, medical treatment, education, a future. They came quietly, without headlines, without fanfare, and they found what the world insisted they wouldn't find here: compassion, belonging, dignity, and a community that wrapped around them like family. In a world growing colder, harsher, more divided each day, the Philippines stood as a reminder of something profoundly simple, yet profoundly rare: that kindness is powerful, that faith is transformative, and that a small country with a big heart can change a life in ways the world rarely notices. And so the message becomes clear, not just to Arshan, not just to those who journey here, but to anyone willing to listen. In a time when nations build walls, the Philippines builds bridges. In a world that forgets compassion, the Philippines remembers. And in the quiet corners of this country, far from the noise of global headlines, humanity still wins. For Filipinos, this story is a testament to who they have always been, even when the world overlooked them. For the rest of us, it is an invitation to look closer, to listen deeper, to recognize the extraordinary heart of a nation that gives more than it has, loves more than it receives, and heals more than it boasts. And for Arshan, it is simple. The Philippines didn't just save my life. It gave me back my hope.